Imagine living in a neighborhood where everything looks perfect on the outside: trimmed lawns, polished fences, and neatly painted houses. But beneath that surface lies a power struggle so intense, it feels more like a battleground than a community. That was the reality for the residents of Liberty Hills, a suburban neighborhood where the HOA board had grown drunk on authority. For years, Liberty Hills was praised as one of the best-maintained neighborhoods in the county. Realtors flaunted its clean streets and tight-knit community to attract wealthy buyers. But in truth, it wasn't unity keeping the place so polished, it was fear. Fear of the HOA board, especially its president, Margaret Green, who residents whispered about as if she were some sort of dictator. Margaret had ruled the HOA for nearly a decade, micromanaging everything from the color of mailboxes to the kind of flowers people could plant. Her word wasn't just policy, it was law. If she didn't like your yard furniture, you'd be fined. If she thought your trash bins weren't placed neatly enough, expect a penalty letter in your mailbox by morning. But one day, Margaret and her board proposed something that would shake the entire neighborhood to its core. The HOA announced their intention to demolish Liberty Park, a small but cherished area at the center of the neighborhood. It wasn't just any park, it was the soul of the community. Families gathered there for barbecues, children played on its swings, and elderly couples walked its winding paths. To many, it was the last untouched piece of freedom in Liberty Hills, a place where HOA rules didn't suffocate people's lives. The justification for demolition was presented as progress. Margaret claimed the park was underutilized and wasting valuable land. The board wanted to replace it with luxury townhomes, units that would increase HOA revenue and raise the value of the neighborhood. But to the residents, it felt like a betrayal. This wasn't just about losing a park. It was about control. The board wasn't asking for input, they were demanding obedience. Anyone who questioned the decision was silenced, fined, or shamed at meetings. The residents felt trapped, powerless against the HOA machine. Yet, behind closed doors, whispers of rebellion began to grow. The question wasn't whether people were angry, it was how far they were willing to go to stop the HOA. And so, the seeds of a community-wide war were planted. The announcement spread like wildfire, igniting fury among residents. For weeks, the HOA sent glossy pamphlets praising the new vision for Liberty Hills, but the only thing people saw was the destruction of something irreplaceable. The board believed fear would keep the neighborhood compliant, but they underestimated the community's love for Liberty Park. It began with small meetings in living rooms and garages. Families gathered in secret, whispering about ways to fight back. They called themselves the Liberty Defenders. It wasn't just the younger families joining in, it was everyone. Parents, retirees, even quiet homeowners who'd never spoken up at meetings before. The park was theirs, and they refused to let it be taken without a fight. The defenders started by digging up HOA records. What they uncovered shocked them. The board had been quietly negotiating contracts with developers for months, lining their own pockets with consulting fees and special incentives. It wasn't about the neighborhood, it was about greed. The defenders knew they had to expose the truth. They began documenting everything: emails, contracts, secret payments. Every piece of evidence painted a darker picture of corruption at the heart of the HOA. But gathering proof was only the first step. They needed the courage to stand up publicly, knowing Margaret's wrath would be brutal. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. Margaret plastered every bulletin board with notices threatening severe consequences for anyone opposing the project. Rumors of fines and even foreclosure circulated, designed to scare residents into silence. But instead of breaking them, fear united the defenders further. They began staging symbolic acts of resistance. Families picnicked in the park every weekend, children drew chalk messages like "Save Liberty" on sidewalks, and someone even placed a giant banner across the playground reading, "This park belongs to the people." Margaret saw this as open rebellion. Her anger grew, and she vowed to crush the opposition at the next HOA meeting. The night of the meeting, Liberty Hills Community Center was packed to capacity. For years, attendance had been low because most residents were too afraid to challenge the board. But this night was different. This night, the people were ready to fight. The HOA board sat on stage, Margaret front and center like a queen surveying her subjects. She smirked as she shuffled her papers, clearly relishing the chaos. One by one, residents voiced their objections, some pleading, some furious. But each time, Margaret dismissed them with icy precision, cutting off their microphones or citing bylaws to silence them. Then, the Liberty Defenders struck. They unveiled their evidence, blown-up images of emails, contracts, and financial records projected on the wall for everyone to see. The room erupted in gasps. The documents showed exactly what the board had tried to hide: corruption, greed, and betrayal. Margaret tried to regain control, shouting about fake documents and defamation, but the crowd wasn't buying it. The board's carefully crafted image of authority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Residents who had once been silent were now emboldened, standing shoulder to shoulder in defiance. But the HOA wasn't finished. Margaret invoked a rarely used clause in the bylaws, granting the board emergency powers to override community objections. She declared the demolition would proceed regardless of the vote. It was a blatant abuse of power, and the residents were stunned. That night, people left the meeting shaken but determined. The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer about saving a park, it was about saving their freedom from a board that saw itself above the law. And in the days that followed, the war escalated beyond anything Liberty Hills had ever seen. The demolition date was set. Heavy machinery was scheduled to roll into Liberty Park at dawn, and Margaret gloated as if victory was already hers. But what she didn't know was that the Liberty Defenders had one final plan, a desperate but powerful stand that would either save their community or destroy it forever. The night before the demolition, residents gathered at the park. Families camped on the grass, children clutched homemade signs, and elders stood guard like sentinels. It wasn't just protest, it was occupation. They formed a human wall around the playground, vowing that no bulldozer would touch their land without going through them first. At sunrise, the roar of engines filled the air. Bulldozers arrived, escorted by contractors and HOA representatives. Margaret stood proudly at the front, clipboard in hand, ready to watch the park fall. But when she saw the crowd, her confidence faltered. News crews had been tipped off by the defenders, and cameras broadcasted the standoff live. The whole county was watching as ordinary families stared down the machines. Every parent, every child, every neighbor had come together, turning the HOA's darkest moment into the community's brightest stand. Contractors hesitated. They hadn't signed up to bulldoze a park full of families, especially with cameras rolling. Pressure mounted as officials arrived, demanding explanations. When the evidence of HOA corruption was presented publicly, the tide turned. Margaret's empire collapsed in real time. By the end of the day, the demolition was halted. Investigations into the HOA began, and within weeks, Margaret and several board members were forced to resign. Charges of fraud and misuse of funds loomed. Liberty Park was saved, but more than that, the neighborhood itself was freed. The people of Liberty Hills had discovered their power, and they would never be silenced again. The story of Liberty Hills spread far beyond their town. To many, it became a symbol of what happens when people stand together against greed and abuse of authority. And to the residents themselves, it was proof that liberty could never truly be demolished.